You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and I've got a case update out of Georgia, where a man that was found guilty of killing his wife with a gun while riding in a car, well, he's now been set free. So let's go back to that warm, late summer night in September of 2016 in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. Danny Jo Carter was driving a white Ford Expedition. Sitting next to her, her longtime friend of 30 years, Diane McIver. The two are Southern upper class. 63-year-old Diane is a well-known business executive. And directly behind Diane, in the rear seat of the Expedition, is her sleepy husband, Claude Lee McIver, better known as Tex. And if his wife is Southern wealthy, Tex is doing his best to keep up, working that Southern wealthy persona. He's an attorney with strong political connections, which we all know equals power. However, the true power in the Ford that night came in the form of the gun resting on Tex's lap. When a loud bang rang out in the SUV, Danny, shocked, turned towards Diane, expecting to see like some sort of explosion that had happened just outside of the stopped car. Well, instead, she heard Diane mutter, "Tex, you shot me." She then slumped forward in her seat. Danny and Tex rushed Diane to a hospital. Not the closest hospital, but to a hospital. However, hours later, Diane died. And despite Tex telling detectives that he had the gun resting on his lap, hand on the grip, when he fell into a slumber and accidentally shot his wife, well, they didn't believe him. They also didn't believe that Tex had the gun there because he was worried about being carjacked in downtown Atlanta. Detectives arrested and charged Tex with felony murder. In 2018, jurors found Tex guilty of intentionally shooting his wife, and he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Now, you're probably sitting here saying, well, that's not much of a story. Guilty and placed behind bars, and you summed that all up in 2 minutes. But there's so much more, because the last 8 years haven't been a quiet, learn a new hobby, spend some time in the prison courtyard kind of sentence for Tex. Back in 2022, a Supreme Court threw out the guilty verdict against Tex. The appeal by Tex's lawyers was successful because in the jury instructions, they weren't allowed to consider a lesser charge than felony murder. Could they have thought it really was just an accident and maybe he was guilty of something like negligent homicide or manslaughter? But instead, they only had felony murder as an option. Well, when that verdict was overturned, Tex was not immediately released from prison. That's because District Attorney Fani Willis announced right off the bat that she would retry Tex for felony murder. Double jeopardy didn't apply here, mostly because the courts are the one that made the mistake. Now, the stage was set for a new trial to be held in December of 2022, and Tex remained imprisoned. As the trial got going and jury selection was completed, this all just over a year ago, the judge slammed on the brakes, and a new trial never happened. The judge said there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. At least at that time, there wasn't enough evidence. Well, late 2022 turned into late 2023, and still there was no trial. Well, last week, Tex finally walked free. Let's, break it all down. On that night in 2016, the three longtime friends were on their way back to their home after spending the weekend at Tex and Diane's not-so-little ranch about an hour away from their Atlanta area home. The three had stopped partway on their journey to enjoy a dinner together, and then as the ladies in the front two seats chatted away, Tex says he began kind of dozing off in the back seat behind Diane. Traffic was heavy, and the drive was slow going as they worked their way through Atlanta. Instead of trudging along on the highway, Danny exited early and was attempting to complete the drive to Diane's Buckhead area home via the downtown side streets. Tex said he warned the ladies that they were in a rougher area of downtown. Tex later clarified that he was worried about the amount of homelessness on the poorly lit streets. After warning the women, Tex said he asked his wife to open the center console and hand him his .38 caliber revolver. She retrieved the gun and handed it to Tex. After a few minutes, Danny rolled to a stop at a city light. Instinctively, Diane used the power locks to secure the doors, and it was at that moment that Danny heard that boom, that explosion that she thought she heard coming from just outside the car. We know it wasn't an explosion, and we know Diane didn't survive her husband shooting her. Whether it be on purpose or accidental was the question at hand. As detectives examined Diane and Tex's life, they learned that the married couple kept their money separate. Both made money, but it wasn't shared money. In the years previous to the shooting, Tex's salary had decreased. He was preparing to retire, and as that paycheck kind of dwindled, his needs and wants weren't being met. So he turned to Diane and asked for a loan. $350,000 was what he needed to keep up with his affluent lifestyle, and prosecutors were certain it was a loan, not a gift. They also contended that the loan was backed up with a threat of being able to foreclose on the ranch property if Tex did not pay it back. Prosecutors also contend that ranch property was kind of a sore spot between the two. Diane wanted to leave the ranch to her godson, and Tex wanted his son from a previous marriage to inherit the ranch. While investigators worked the case, trying to dial in on the shooting, Tex took a big step. He auctioned off all of Diane's expensive belongings, like a fire sale, if you will. When asked by detectives why he held the auction, he said his attorneys had advised him to do so because her will specifically asked for the sale to happen. Detectives said they also had some concerns that Tex was just acting a little wonky after her death. An ER nurse allegedly told detectives that she heard him say he shot her at his home, not in the car, and that he was at his home cleaning his gun when he did so. His defense attorneys made sure to point out that the ER nurse was the only one who heard anything like that, and that many other hospital staff members were in the room during those hours of care. Another thing that bothered detectives is that they say when they interviewed a man that worked with Tex, he told them that Tex said his wife had died in a car accident. He said Tex didn't even mention a gun. Detectives said they also had concerns about Tex dating quickly after his wife's death. And of course, there's the whole money issue. Prosecutors felt Tex clearly had a financial motive. He wouldn't have to pay the loan back if she was gone. He also would inherit her real estate, like the luxury condo that they both lived in near Buckhead. And remember the ranch? Well, if Diane was gone, prosecutors theorized that Tex could enjoy the ranch for himself and then give the ranch to his son when he dies. Tex's attorneys said that just doesn't add up. Diane was the moneymaker, and if she was gone, then the money dried up as well. All right, during the initial trial, defense and prosecutors both used the aid of chairs in the courtroom to kind of show how the shooting occurred. Tex's attorneys showed how the gun was resting on Tex's lap and that he was groggy when he pulled the trigger, and that the trajectory of the bullet explained where the gun was resting. They argued that if he truly was concocting a plan to quote unquote accidentally shoot her, he would have done it on the rural stretch of road and not in downtown Atlanta. They're thinking that in the rural area, it would have been much harder to get to a hospital to administer life-saving care. The prosecutors used leather car chairs to show that Tex would have had to raise the gun and shoot in order to wound Diane the way that she was wounded. Well, jurors agreed with the prosecutors, and they found Tex guilty of felony murder. They also found him guilty of influencing a witness. Now, that charge and conviction stemmed from him coaching Danny while they were waiting to talk with officers at the hospital. He allegedly told Danny to lie to officers and say she wasn't in the SUV when he fired the gun. Okay, this one's weird for me. How does that even help him? Danny could have actually been a witness to him dozing off and also to him being in a potentially unsafe part of the city. Whatever the reasoning, he was found guilty of that and some additional gun charges. Now, when the Supreme Court overturned the conviction, they did so stating that the prosecutors did not show any malice between the couple. The court also ruled that the shooting could not be proven to be deliberate, so they should have had a lesser charge to consider for a potential guilty verdict. The Supreme Court also felt that Diane's will should not have been entered into evidence. See, there was some lack of clarification on when the supposed will was established and why the new will even potentially could have existed. So the court said it shouldn't have been shared with jurors if it could not be verified. Well, following the overturning, Tex spent that extra year in prison, but his future wasn't dim because he eventually was offered a plea deal. Prosecutors allowed Tex to plead guilty to unintentionally causing his wife's death. That's much less severe than felony murder. He was sentenced in December of 2023 for that charge, and his sentence was 15 years, 8 in prison and 7 on probation. The probation does have guardrails. The first 5 years of the 7 will be served in home confinement with an ankle monitor to track Tex movements. And remember, the crime happened in 2016, with Tex being arrested and put behind bars in 2017. So in 2025, we're real close to that 8 years. In a statement to the judge when Tex accepted the plea deal, he said the following: "She died as a result of my actions. Plain and simple. I have worn my wedding ring since the day we were married, and I intend to wear it until the day I die. I hope we're at a point where we're not judging each other and we can all move on. She's my angel, and she's waiting for me in heaven." The parole board met with Tex a few weeks back, and they accepted the plan for his probation. Last week, Tex walked out of his Georgia prison. He is now 82 years old. The parole contained a couple of extra stipulations. Tex will not be allowed to go near Diane's place of employment, and he also cannot have any contact with Danny. Remember, she's the driver of the car and longtime friend of Diane's. My take on this? Both Diane's boss and Danny, well, I think they believe Diane's death was not an accident. Her boss said as much at the plea hearing a year ago. So this stipulation's just added to create some distance between those people. Diane's obituary was lengthy and full of her many business accomplishments, referencing her 43 years working for U.S. enterprises. In that position, she helped develop business ideas, some of which she was part owner of. Businesses like commercial real estate development, outdoor advertising, what you would see on billboards, especially those centered around airports. She even had a business associated with truck stop ownership. Now, the businesses were wide and ranging and successful. She was also godmother to multiple boys and girls, and her fashion sense was highlighted in her extensive hat collection. And one final note about the obituary: it cites that Tex and she were happily married for 16 years and that they were always at each other's side. Let me know if you think Tex is guilty, or if at 82 years old, it's just time for him to be home on home containment. And now to another fine example of the severe lack of emotional regulation in today's world. This one out of Wisconsin, where a 19-year-old man allegedly started a fire at his congressman's office because, are you ready for this? He didn't like his vote on the Tik Tok ban. The Fond du Lac Police Department reported on Sunday that Republican Representative Glenn Grothman's office was targeted by the young Arson on Saturday night. It was actually in the middle of the night, Saturday between Sunday, but That's how they worded it in their press release. So for those of you who aren't up to date on the TikTok drama, back in April of last year, both Democrats and Republicans voted in favor of a bill that mandated TikTok's China-based parent company, ByteDance. They were saying they had to cease operations in America by this last Sunday, January 19th. Basically, politicians said they were worried that ByteDance is mining Americans' data, and that makes America not safe. It's actually a very complex issue, with some thinking the ban has nothing to do with safety. Instead, it's actually more about control. Also, the whole argument has been muddled by opinions that TikTok is dangerous for children, which is true and understandable, but not even close to the entirety of the reason the ban was voted for and implemented. Well, former President Biden signed the bill into law last summer, and then that law was challenged in a Supreme Court case. Last week, the Supreme Court ruled that the law requiring TikTok to be majority owned by an American company was upheld. And that meant the app would most likely go dark, which it did on Saturday night. Users were met with a message from TikTok when they tried to access the app, explaining that due to the law and the upholding of the law, the app could not be accessed in America. However, that ban was temporary, at least for now. President Trump had told reporters that he would extend the time window for ByteDance and a prospective American owner or owners to work the kinks out. So TikTok is back up and running for 90 days-ish. And we are in a wait-and-see pattern while users can still enjoy their social media scrolling. That leaves us with our 19-year-old. Well, police say he was so upset by the app going dark on Saturday that at 1:02 a.m. on Sunday, the fire department responded to a structure fire at the representative's office. As fire companies worked to extinguish the fire department officials found the 19-year-old man wandering outside near the congressman's office. When questioned, police say he admitted to starting the fire. Luckily, no one was harmed in the structure fire. Representative Grothman told the local ABC affiliate WISN that the fire at his office is a perfect example of what not to do when upset with your politician and the things they voted for. He said the following: "The TikTok issue is really secondary. I deal with obviously dozens of issues up here, and we cannot have people, if they disagree with me, say the way to settle that disagreement is, let's try and burn down the congressman's office." The alleged arson has not been identified, but he is being held at the Fond du Lac County Jail on a charge of arson. And you know those stories I've brought you about the criminals who call the cops and say something like, "Hey, go arrest my drug dealer because he stole my money and didn't provide me drugs." Yeah, I've reported on those stories here at Rise in Crime that happened just like that. Well, now a Florida woman is trying to one-up those criminals because on Saturday, Brevard County Deputy Lexi Gordon and her police dog, Aurora, pulled over a U-Haul being driven with no headlights illuminated. And it's the middle of the night. Sketchy, right? Well, when Deputy Gordon approached the truck and asked the driver if her dog Aurora could search the truck, the driver agreed. He allegedly even told Deputy Gordon that there was nothing illegal inside. Maybe he should have consulted with his passenger, 31-year-old Taryn Acree. See, Taryn had some bags with her. One of the bags had an inscription on the outside that said, "Definitely not a bag full of drugs." Spoiler alert, according to Deputy Gordon and Aurora, there indeed were drugs inside the bag. The Brevard deputies say they allegedly seized 8 grams of methamphetamine and some needles. Also Narcan and a digital scale. Even better, there were baggies to presumably package the drugs and cut straws to portion the drugs. Taryn was arrested on charges of possession of meth with intent to sell and possession of drug paraphernalia. And it seems Taryn isn't much of a quick learner because the sheriff is reporting that Taryn was arrested in Melbourne, Florida, about 2 weeks ago, just prior to this arrest. Again, in that arrest, deputies pulled the car over for a traffic violation, and the police dog alerted the deputies to the presence of drugs inside the car. In that search, police say they found 7 baggies with what they believe to be meth, and those baggies were inside Taryn's purse. Now, a probable cause statement from that arrest says she had a total of 14.5 grams of meth. For the Melbourne incident, she was charged with trafficking in meth, possession of meth with intent to sell, and also possession of drug paraphernalia. The Brevard County Sheriff did a little poking at the bond setting in the system for the Melbourne arrest when he wrote in a Facebook post the following. Taryn was arrested on January 6 with no bond, and of course, she bonded out on January 8th after getting a ridiculous bond set of $15,500. But hey, that's a story for another day. So, with those 2 arrests in 1 month, will Taryn stay in jail this time? The Brevard sheriff is pretty skeptical. He wrote the following. You know, there's a quote that says, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And folks, let me tell you, this is absolute insanity that we just keep letting criminals out of jail on ridiculous bonds so they can break more laws. Oh well, as I said earlier, that's a story for a different day that is coming real soon, because like you, I've had enough. All right, you guys, I'm with the sheriff here. I don't talk much about sentencing structures with drug offenses, but I could go on for hours about sentencing and paroling of sexual predators, especially those predators who have abused children. Maybe someday we'll value the safety of our little ones and value the safety of our streets. Finally today, it's time for a Gilgo Beach Serial Killer update. I've had some of you asking for a case update, and I've been just sort of waiting to consolidate the various additions to the charges, so let's dive in. Remember, a year and a half ago, architect Rex Heuermann was arrested for the deaths of 3 of the 4 Gilgo 4. These were 4 women whose remains were found on Gilgo Beach, wrapped up in burlap. Searchers stumbled across the remains back in December of 2010 when they were looking for a different missing woman, Shannon Gilbert, and also when some remains were found by fishermen. All of it was kind of combined. Sadly, Shannon wasn't found when the searchers happened amongst the remains, some of which were estimated to have been there for years. The discovery of the Gilgo 4 on that Long Island Beach area prompted more searches to be conducted months later in March and April of 2011. During those searches, 6 more sets of remains were discovered. And a side note, Shannon Gilbert's story is so interesting, and we have covered her disappearance here on Rise in Crime, and lots of other podcasts have covered her disappearance as well. Her remains were eventually found. About a year after the additional remains were discovered on Gilgo Beach, the working theory is Shannon became lost in the marsh and died from either exposure to the cold or an accidental drowning. You're going to find tons of theories on this out there on the internet if you want to go down a rabbit hole. Okay, but let's get back to Rex and the women who were killed. Rex was arrested for 3 of the women found: Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, and Amber Costello. But following an extensive police search of both his electronics, his truck, and his home and office, authorities now believe that Rex also killed Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Jessica Taylor, and Sandra Costilla. Those victims' murders spanned from the early 1990s to the 2000s. Well, in December, authorities added another potential murder victim to Rex's charges. Now, Valerie Mack has been tied to Rex, at least according to the detectives working the case. Now, during those charges for the 7th murder, we learned that authorities believe the killings of the 7 women occurred in the basement of the home he shared with his wife and 2 children. Prosecutors allege that Rex adhered to a disturbing planning document that he created to perform the murders. Those plans included using pushpins and tarps in the murders in the basement. The plans also had abbreviations like DS and TRG. Authorities believe DS stands for dump site, and that TRG might mean target. The planning document also allegedly referenced the phrase, "small is good." And all of the victims were petite women. Prosecutors stated in the hearing that they aren't required to prove where the murders happened, but they contended that the planning document shows a consistent theme that the commission of the murders occurred at Rex's family home. Authorities say that found with the planning document were clippings about the Gilgo Beach investigation. More has been revealed over the last few months, like the kind of testing that's been done on the hairs found with the bodies. See, several human hairs were located on one of the bodies, and prosecutors say that those hairs belonged to Rex's estranged wife and daughter, or one or the other. Prosecutors are asking that nuclear DNA testing, which has previously never been entered into evidence in the state of New York, well, they're asking that those results of that nuclear DNA testing be admissible. The nuclear testing is supposed to kind of dial in a little clearer that the hairs belong to Rex's estranged wife. And it's important to note, the prosecutors feel like they have cleared Rex's wife and daughter from any involvement in the murders. See, the daughter was easy. She wasn't even born during some of the murders, and then in others, she was either 3 or 4 years old. And prosecutors say that the wife was essentially always in another state when the murders occurred. The attorney for the estranged wife has stated that his client is innocent and that she also believes that Rex is not capable of committing the murders. He also said that the wife plans on attending the trial and withholding her judgment until she sees all of the evidence that will be presented. The judge is reviewing the nuclear DNA request. The judge is also reviewing the request by the defense attorney for Rex that the individual cases be severed, meaning not all 7 murders would be tried in one court setting. The defense is accusing the prosecutors of, quote, bootstrapping the cases together, presumably to kind of stick with the narrative that the state believes Rex is a serial killer. If the cases rise and fall on their own, as the defense attorney has requested, then Rex probably seems maybe less vile. You just won't have that label of serial killer on him, is what I'm guessing. Those requests will be reviewed and decided on by the judge in probably late February, early March. And another update that we haven't discussed since the last update several months ago. Rex Heuermann finally spoke in court. It was short. He told the judge, "Your Honor, I am not guilty of any of these charges." His defense attorney told the court that Rex has been frustrated that he has yet to speak and affirm his innocence. He also stated that the planning document and the news clippings were just Rex showing interest in the case, a sort of research project, if you will. He claimed that it's not weird since the Gilgo Beach murders are infamous in the area. Now, I'll of course continue to watch this case. It's far from over, or for that matter, even close to a trial date. I am interested to know what you think so far about the case. Let me know in the comments. And now to some of the comments you left from Monday's episode. Most of you felt like Jordan Brown, that's the 11-year-old boy who was convicted of killing his father's pregnant girlfriend and then who was exonerated with a wrongful conviction finding. Well, most of you felt like Jordan did deserve compensation for the time that he spent behind bars and for the youth that was taken from him. Ali on YouTube wants to know why those who fabricated evidence aren't held criminally liable. Well, the answer seems to be they really don't have proof that the evidence was fabricated. The detectives feel they had solid interviews, and without recordings, we can't know if the 7-year-old sister was coached into giving the answers that she gave, which ultimately is why Jordan wasn't compensated. They just couldn't prove that the detectives did something wrong. And Misty from YouTube, to answer your question about the murder, I do hope that Kenzie's murder is an open and active case. I'm very familiar with a wrongful conviction from my city, and after that person spent 20 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, a new police chief leading a new group of detectives found the real killer. We can only hope for the same here. And the transverse of that, a YouTube listener who goes by Smash the Bug, Well, he still thinks Jordan committed the murder and that his dad is just covering for him. So if you're talking to smash the bug, there is no murderer to find. He's already been found. Now to Arindia, a YouTube listener who lives in the same area as Ronald. That's our missing realtor from last week's episode. Please DM me if you hear of anything we can share to our listeners. If you live in that area and you get any kind of a glimpse of what's going on, I'd love to hear from you. And with Ronald's disappearance, Min is asking if they actually track down, anybody who is voluntarily disappearing, to track them down and verify with those people if they want to be missing. It's really a good question. And it varies by police department. Some do and some don't. It's not a great answer, but if a police force is stretched thin and all factors are pointing to a voluntary disappearance, they're most likely going to kind of move that case to the bottom of the pile, one that they don't need to be working on when they've got other cases that they feel are much more urgent. I think this is probably why Ronald's family is moving forward, doing their best to find their loved one and their own research. All right, you guys, that's your Thursday episode of Rise in Crime. Thanks for joining me here on the podcast and YouTube broadcast. A quick merch note. If you've been waiting for the new merch drop from Murder with My Husband, it's available. Just visit their profile on Instagram for the link. And a big thank you to you guys. I do say I have the best listeners. You hear me say that almost every podcast. Please leave a 5-star review and a positive comment if you haven't yet so. And you can like and follow us on all of our social media and YouTube accounts here at Oh No Media. That's, of course, Murder with My Husband, Into the Dark, and Rise in Crime. You can join me again on Monday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.